Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Irene Maslowski. I'm an adjunct professor at New York University and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair for the PRSA, the Educators Academy. IPR and PRSA Educators Academy have been partnering on the diversity in the PR classroom since June 2020. Today, we have a special episode on how employers and professors can adapt from findings from a new IPR Cision report titled "The Business Case for Focusing on Employee Mental Health" to address mental health at work, in the classroom, and beyond. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our sponsor, the Moody College of Communications at the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you once again for supporting diversity in the PR classroom. First, we'd like to welcome Olivia Kresick. Olivia is Senior Research and Outreach Manager at the Institute for Public Relations, a nonprofit research foundation that creates, curates, and promotes research and initiatives in the public relations industry. I'd also like to introduce Karen Stockert. Karen is a sector lead for Insights Consulting at Cision, a global leader in PR, marketing, and social media management, technology, and intelligence that helps brands and organizations to identify, connect, and engage with customers and stakeholders to drive business results. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. Lastly, just a few housekeeping rules. This is a Q&A type forum. To ask a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat or raise your virtual hand. Once you've been called on, please remember to state your name and your organization. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, please type the message to the hosts in the chat and we will read your question aloud. Only the moderators can see your question, so you will remain anonymous. Today's session will be recorded and will be available for playback within 48 hours. Lastly, please be respectful to the hosts on the call and to everyone on the call by keeping yourself muted unless you intend to ask a question. I'd like to introduce Anita Henry of the Institute for Public Relations, who will be the moderator for today's program.
Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Olivia and Karen, for being here. In today's session, we're going to do a little bit differently than we normally do our DPRC sessions, where Karen and Olivia are going to present the business case for focusing on mental health in the classroom, in the workplace, and beyond. Only thing that I would like to say before we get started is this month is Mental Health Awareness Month, and this is a subject that impacts us all. As we learn more about mental health, we all have different definitions about mental health and how it's perceived. And so I'm very grateful to have both of these presenters here to talk about the research, and so that we can learn more and we can allow ourselves to feel more empathy for ourselves and those around us who may be having mental health issues. So if you happen to be in crisis today, we're going to share some resources with you throughout this call. And I would like for you to just enjoy this presentation, glean from it what you can, and implement what you can for yourself, for your teammates, and for your students. So without further ado, Olivia and Karen, take it away.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Do you want to get started with the next slide? Brittany, can we advance? Thank you. Karen, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Welcome everyone. Olivia and I are really excited to talk with you about this research that we spent a few months on last year working on, and it was really revealing about some of the things that have come up as a result, I believe, of this sort of very disruptive environment we've been in, primarily around the COVID lockdown. But we settled on this topic in light of all of that. And between Cision and IPR, we identified some themes that we wanted to explore within this, very significant, important, kind of salient issue of mental health in the workplace. And we collaborated on how we would explore this in social media in terms of the kinds of things we wanted to focus on, and by extension, the kinds of things that we, couldn't go deep on, but I think we've got a very rich study here to discuss, and we've tailored it to some extent to this audience as well. But what we decided to look at, or what we focused on in our kind of collaboration in the creation of our queries, was these 5 bullets here, these issues of mental health in the workplace, in particular, how employees and employers might perceive it, differing perspectives, and coming together on those perspectives or not. The issue of burnout, quiet quitting, which came onto all of our radars, I think, to a certain extent last fall, and it's sort of out there now in the parlance. The 4-day work week, which is a sort of a newer kind of idea that's being explored in some markets, and we'll go into that a little bit. And then some successful corporate mental health initiatives that may provide lessons for employers and for educators as well. So the date range we looked at was the first 10 months of 2022. And to do this, from my role, I started with our platform, Cision's platform. It's called BrandWatch Consumer Research, and it gives us the opportunity to look at the social media conversation around this big topic, in particular, like just really break it down. I'll show you that in the next slide, which is necessary because this topic, and this is not unusual to see upwards over 1 million posts, Twitter posts on this topic. So when you're talking about 1 million Twitter posts, you need to have some ways to kind of like get into there and understand what that big conversation is all about. So if we look at the next slide, you can see some of the ways that we use our platform to kind of dive into the data, dive into the content, and understand who's talking, what they're talking about, who's when they're tweeting, what gets significant engagement, resonates with people, and some other breakdowns that I think are also significant to bring up in terms of generations and to some extent gender. So if you look at the top left quadrant there, I'm just showing one view of, so what we do is we create queries, we use tags to look at various topics within the results of those queries, and then there's all kinds of ways we can chart things, and this is just a sort of a glimpse of what the tool can do. So we create dashboards that allow us to look at our data in many different ways. On the top left, you'll see some of the people who generated the most engagement around the themes that they talked about. And I think this first one, this influencer, not a huge number of followers, 2,700 followers is, if you're talking about an influencer, not on the super high end, but what she had to say in one tweet about not being kind of being content with doing her work, but also maintaining a focus on what she really cares about in life, and balancing that really resonated with people. I think she had over 50,000 retweets, and also like something like 4,000 replies, comments. So there's so this is kind of how we start to understand, like, okay, this is the kind of thing that is really resonating with people. Another way, we can look at on the top right, that we can, our algorithms within BrandWatch can help us break down the conversation by gender. And this isn't, it's not that we can determine this with every single person who's tweeting, but it's a good representation of the breakdown in this case, and what topics might have been driving a spike for either men or women. Admittedly, there are also a lot of that are non-identified in this group. So this is certainly not all the authors. If you look on the bottom left, another way we could do a breakdown is by generation. And so, we'll probably be getting into this a bit later in the presentation, but we saw an outsized representation from Gen Z and millennials. And what's kind of cool is we can drill a bit deeper into that. So we've got 42% of the conversation coming from, according to BrandWatch, from the Gen Z population. And so I drilled into that, and I did a word cloud where I was looking at what those Gen Z folks, what are top topics that, or terms that are showing up in their conversation by gender. So I can look at it a bunch of different ways. I can look at, hashtags that in this case, Gen Z was using a lot. I can look at a gender breakdown. I can look at top authors. So just, I guess, shorthand to say, our tool gives us a lot of ways of looking at the data set, all the content, the discussion around mental health in the workplace. So that sort of sets us up for what Olivia will be leading us on next. And happy to answer any questions now or later in the presentation about this.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yes, we dug into these data, and we really came out with some interesting key findings. Some were more surprising than others. So I'm going to go ahead and discuss all of our key findings, but I'll point out some of the ones that are particularly salient in the classroom for this group. But first and foremost, what we found was that there was a large gap between organizations and employees when it came to the topic of mental health being a priority. So a lot of the employees that we saw information from on Twitter were discussing that they didn't really care anymore about being motivated to climb the corporate ladder. They just wanted to prioritize quality of life, financial stability. They really wanted to focus on helping others. So totally different priorities with our employee group than we have seen in the past with other groups that might have been a little more motivated by just climbing the corporate ladder. However, these users felt that there was a gap because companies still expected the employees to be primarily motivated by climbing a corporate ladder. So the employees on Twitter made it apparent that they felt there was a gap. And they specifically called out organizations like Amazon and others, highlighting a headline that I believe was run by Business Insider, that Amazon was worried that they were going to run out of workers. And these employees pointed out on Twitter, maybe you wouldn't have to be worried about running out of workers if you focused on not burning out the employees that you already have, right? So certain companies sort of made waves on social media for things that weren't so great in showcasing that disconnect or that gap between employers and employees on mental health, employee mental health being a priority. They also dove into the topic of burnout and said that burnout as a term places the blame on employees for the problem, whereas companies should be the parties that need to do something about it. So that was a factor, and we'll talk a little bit more about burnout in our later findings, and we'll delve into that a little bit more. But they also, these workers on Twitter, said that work was overwhelmingly a factor in their mental well-being. One person even went so far to explain that happiness in their job was the primary contributor to their mental health. So work plays a very outsized role in mental health, according to these users. compared to other factors in their lives. So we found that this was purpose enough for us to really dive into what factors in the workplace impact mental health and how companies might be able to address this, because work plays such a large role in people's mental health. So with that, we took a look at the generational differences. Brittany, if you could just go back to the previous slide really quickly. Thank you. Gen Z and millennials were, out of all of the generational groups that we explored, were the most frequent contributors to conversations about mental health. And Gen Z users were not afraid to frankly speak about how poorly they thought their organizations were doing at handling mental health issues. They would even comment on, as you can see here, sort of feeble attempts of employers to help their mental health, like giving you a meditation app, as this one person on Twitter said, obviously feeling that this is not enough, to fix such a large issue in the workplace. Karen, do you have something to add?
I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting that, and I know you're going to speak to millennials as well, but the younger generations is playing a big role in destigmatizing this issue of mental health, which, I mean, let's face it, we're all vulnerable, and it's been a wild ride for the past, few years. So I find this a really encouraging development, is that it's kind of coming out into the open, and it's becoming something that, okay, we can talk about this, but we need our employers to understand. I think also, something you said earlier, the fact that work plays such a big role in your life satisfaction and your mental health. Anything you're going to do, that much of your waking hours, that much of your day, whether it's studying or, being in a learning context of any kind, or being in the workplace, I think is going to be a major factor. If you're happy in your work, you're going to be largely, it lifts you in terms of your outlook and your self-worth. And if it's not going so well, it's the opposite. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of sort of build on, or I guess comment back on some of the things you mentioned, Olivia.
Yes, thank you so much, Karen. And Gen Z is the primary generation that's in the classroom right now in colleges, right? So we're also wondering if you all want to drop in the chat, have you been seeing any issues with mental health with your students in the classroom? Have any of your students spoken up about their mental health issues? Right now, we're seeing that they're speaking up on Twitter. So I don't know if you all have been hearing anything verbally as you've been interacting with them, but it would be interesting.
Olivia and Karen, we have a question, if you guys don't mind. Wadney Julian asked, did you notice a trend in specific industries who spoke out about mental health on social media? And I think this might come a little bit later in the presentation, but wanted to ask that.
Karen, I think you did find some differences. Do you want to address that?
Sure. Hi, Wadney. we work together. It's so good to see you here. So yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that we touched on, but for example, like we did not segment the conversation around whether people were educators or healthcare workers or working in offices or working in the hospitality industry. I think we touched on it, as Olivia suggests later, but there's a whole opportunity to go deeper on those issues, because there is a difference. And having for example, the luxury that, I'll just speak for us at Cision, of being able to, for the most part, work remotely, and for many people that is a preference, or in the cases of many people who are, living near an office, to work on a hybrid basis. Those are usually things that can help with feeling better about your work, because you feel like you have more control over your situation, I think. But that's not always the case. So there are a bunch of ways we could go deeper on that. And so while we touched on it, it's a really rich area. And I saw anecdotally, healthcare workers, who are definitely traumatized, and some educators who were talking about how hard that can be. People who have to show up in person to, work at a restaurant, or, in other roles in the hospitality industry. This was a stressful experience for them, and they do talk about it a little bit. So, good question.
Thank you, Karen. And yes, thank you for that question. So that is how that breakdown looked when we were digging into the primary data. Brittany, could you please advance to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about millennials. Thank you. So millennials were the other large generational group that really talked about and were more outspoken about mental health issues on Twitter. Millennials specifically focused on return to office and how that actually impacted their mental health. So they said that return to office was quote unquote boomer talk, kind of looking, directly pointing at the difference between themselves and another generation. And they said that the commute was a large part of their mental health when it came to work. And that would now, be a greater burden to their mental health if they had to return to an office and do that commute again. So that was one of the larger factors that our millennial groups really zeroed in on. And some millennials even went so far as to say that they quit their jobs without having another job lined up for their mental health because they just couldn't take it anymore. So this group was, without really pointing fingers at one party or another, just indicating that, they were having issues with these specific areas, with the commute, with return to office, and that they were just pushed so far that they had to quit without having anything else lined up. Brittany, next slide, please. Thank you. So there was a lot of talk online about burnout and quiet quitting and who was to blame. So discussions surrounding these topics were driven by spikes of coverage that focused on some polarizing opinions on the factors that were impacting burnout and the coping mechanisms that people were using for burnout. And then later in the year, we saw a large spike, which you can see here by the green line. It spiked in September, and that was for quiet quitting. So quiet quitting really was a term that picked up in the latter half of the year. And one of the significant contributors of this conversation, as you can see in September, was a TikTok post by a comedian that was defining quiet quitting that ended up going viral. So that drove a lot of the traffic that you see in that green spike toward the later half of this graph. So we saw, Brittany, if you could go back to that graph really quickly, please.
Yes, sorry. I don't know what happened.
That's okay. We also surprisingly didn't see as many burnout conversations in May as we expected of last year, given that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So we were specifically looking at that, and you can see from the graph, I know the numbers are a little small, I apologize. But in May of last year, there wasn't a whole lot of a traffic spike in either of these topics between burnout or quiet quitting. And another piece of that quiet quitting was also people would mention acting your wage, which we included in the quiet quitting line item on this graph. And each of these was defined as mentally disengaging from one's work. So I don't know if, Irene, I know you posted in the chat that you're seeing an extreme number of students who are experiencing mental issues. Thank you for sharing that. Are any of you also seeing students mentally disengaging from work? I know students don't really, I guess, quiet quit per se, but burnout does impact our students. So if I'd be interested to see if any of you are seeing that phenomenon playing out in the classroom right now. But likewise, media coverage explained that the phenomenon of burnout could be driving employee disengagement, and media coverage stopped short of blaming one party, unlike Twitter users who were very vocal about explaining which party they thought was responsible for these issues. Media coverage was a little more, they stayed out of that area quite as much as the employees did, but they still kind of talked about this whole idea of burnout driving engagement and what we are seeing in the larger scale. So those were some of our findings. And with that, I'll provide a couple of, what do we do? This is obviously an issue that we are seeing throughout. Here are some recommendations that we provided for primarily employers, given what we found in this study. And we found that one of the most beneficial tools that organizations could provide for their employees, and perhaps might also be applicable to a classroom setting, was a peer-led outlet, like an employee resource group. We found that employees tended to trust their peers most, rather than their employer or someone higher up to discuss their mental health concerns with. So these communities of peers can be provided with little financial cost. I don't know if any of your organizations have employed any sort of like student resource groups for things like mental health concerns, but that is one thing that the research suggested would be the most helpful tool that employers could provide for their employees. And we saw some companies that were leading the charge with this focus on mental health. Some standouts were Salesforce, CVS Health, Deloitte did had a lot of coverage in media outlets about their mental health initiatives. So those are a couple that stood out. But more often than not, employers that were lauded as doing a greater job than most with mental health were doing things like supporting management to better understand well-being and belonging and how they can help the people that report up to them, right? They explained that these companies were investing financially in employee wellness, which could include free visits with mental health professionals or reimbursing out-of-network mental health support and other wellness initiatives similar to that. And overall, sort of with these findings and our advice to employers or organizations seeing this research, we just urged organizations to just listen to their employees, hear their needs and provide tools for them depending on what they're saying their needs are. If that's peer-led groups, if that's financial incentives or more like mental wellness days off, more PTO, more paid parental leave. These all were factors that we saw that were playing into employee mental health and that they were asking for to help improve their mental health overall. So those were some of our findings. Karen, I don't know if you have anything to add to that piece.
Yeah, I was going to say, these sort of and the kind of soft benefits that Olivia just described are investments, but when we're this very this job market that's still like very tight, these are things that can really pay off when you have engaged, productive, you can retain engaged and productive employees. I think this is really strong advice, and so it seems like an investment. You're not really sure whether it's going to when it's going to pay, but it makes sense, and it's the sort of thing that when you're trying to attract new talent, people are looking at these things. They care about these things, and prospective employees care about these things, and are they're weighing those in their decisions about where they'll feel supported, and which prospective new employer will help them feel supported with in any of their wherever they are in life, at any generation. But also when you're talking about, for example, there's a lot of transphobia out there, and our employees who feel like they're supported and welcomed and understood are there's tremendous assets if you make sure that they understand that they are valued and for who they are, just whatever they're bringing to the situation, or what to the workplace. Let's see here, I was gonna, the ERGs, I'm on one of the employee resource groups for Cision, and I really love our ERG, and it's been growing, and we're doing some really interesting things, and it's a great kind of proxy for the fact that I don't go into the office and have those interactions with colleagues about things that are other than my work, but things that are important to me. I think they're very supportive, and yeah, just there's just. I guess I was going to say too that what we saw as a significant disruption with everybody, in March of 2020, being, going into lockdown, major disruption, kind of upsetting to our, routine, our pattern of working, but also kind of forcing a reassessment of what we care about. And sometimes those major disruptions, it takes a while, but they can result in things coming out that need to come out, and changes happening that were overdue to happen. And I'm seeing this as, like some good things can come out of this. And I think, this report kind of points to that. It's really tough, but the fact that we're talking about these things and that companies are starting to do these things and recognize that it's good for business is, it's encouraging. And by the same token, I'm more distant from the academic setting, but I believe it belongs there too. So anyway.
Yes, thank you, Karen. We did see, and to Karen's point, in our research that some of the decreased work weeks or mental health days off did result in increased revenue for the company, productivity, quality of life, improved mental health and employees. So there are very real impacts of these initiatives that are benefiting the bottom line for these organizations that are implementing them. So that was impactful. And also one thing that Karen touched on was the importance of her ERG as a remote worker. We saw that in the research as well, that these social groups were even more important for employees who said that they worked from home. So companies should be creating these sort of social opportunities for people who are either hybrid or fully remote.
Awesome. Irene, you placed in the chat that you had something to share from what you're seeing in the classroom regarding mental health in your students. Would you like to jump in here?
I definitely would. So, just a little bit, my background, I've spent, decades on the agency side, business side of public relations, and I've been teaching for about 7, 8 or 8 years now. So I teach on the graduate level and undergrad as well. At the graduate level, not so much, although it's stressful for them, but I see on the undergrad level, an enormous amount of mental health issues coming along. And this can range anywhere from their schoolwork, their interning, they are working part-time. Many of them are paying their way through school. And I think a lot of it depends on perhaps the school that you teach at and the group. One of the schools that I teach at in New York City College, many of the students are first generation students. Their parents are immigrants, and they've not gone through the college process, and their background is somewhat different. And these students are trying to do it all. So I'm finding that they very often will come to me with, I've seen students, for example, where they've been straight A's halfway through the semester, and then they start dropping off. And they say, I have mental health issues, the stress is a lot, I've got problems at home, I have this, I have that. And so, as an educator, you want to help them, and you want to get them through. And we find ways to do that. We look at different methods of being able to not just pass them through, but help them through. But beyond that, what are we doing with them to get them so that they will be prepared to go into the workforce? It isn't just about getting them through the 4 years of college. I've had students at other universities where their parents are paying the way and they, aren't working, and they're still falling down. And then they write to me and say, I'm having mental health issues. Well, again, they need support. But, I say to them, we have to work through this, because then we are not preparing you for the workforce. You can't come to me at the end of the semester and say, when you haven't handed in, 4 out of, 10 assignments, that I can pass you through because you've got issues. We have to find ways to work through it. And if we don't do that, then again, we're not only not getting them through school, but we're not really preparing them for the workforce. So how does that continue to be a process that they carry over, right? So this is I find a very large issue, and it's a predominant number of particularly undergrad students that really need that help and that support to not only get through, but then to move on to their careers as well.
Irene, I'm curious, do you feel like you've seen this become a bigger problem, say in the past 5 to 10 years, or how's it evolving or devolving?
Well, I think COVID, certainly, as you've all outlined, has certainly become, a big part of the issue. And I've been teaching about 8 years now, and I see a much greater predominance of it growing. And again, I want to preface it by saying I think it depends where we teach, and are the group of students that we're working with, but they want help. They want that support, and so. There are mental health, opportunities that they can get through the university. Some of them struggle with writing. Some of them struggle with a particular topic. And so we try to make sure that they get those, that support. But as an educator, I look for different ways that I can really be able to guide them, maybe sometimes too much individually, but I want to see them succeed. And again, if I don't, I could give in and say, okay, we'll forget about those 4 assignments. We can't do that, because you're not going to do that in the workplace. And if you do it, you'll lose your job. And I use that phrase a lot when I see that students are kind of, slacking off. But there definitely is a much larger predominance now than there was, 5 years ago, to answer your question.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Karen and Olivia, I have a question for you. When we go back to the generational differences that you found, and you said that millennials and Zs were the main ones who were talking about this issue. What differences did you find with boomers and Gen X? I will self-identify as a Gen Xer. And would you say that those differences in conversation have to do with certain generations not being on the platform of Twitter, or that the generations just tend to care about different topics or not want to engage in conversations about mental health?
Olivia, would you like me to try to? That's a great question, Anitra. So the couple of things there, and I think you hit on some of them. There is more stigma, although it's dropping with older generations around talking about these issues. I think Gen Z and millennials are in more kind of maybe vulnerable stages of their lives in terms of like trying to figure out what their path is, what they care, they're assessing their values. They are more active on social media. And I guess, and this is something maybe Wadney's observed too in the work that we do, the people who have, who for whom these issues are most salient are the ones who are talking on social, that's where we see the activity. So if it's an issue that's like, it's just not, as resonant for a boomer, or they've got it figured out, or they're the leadership and they're making the decisions, maybe they're not going to be as vocal you know, because maybe they're more aligned with the organization itself, and so they're coming from a different perspective. And I think that, so we did, you know, like if you go back to the, well, we don't have to go back to that slide, but I'm just going to remind myself of the pie chart and how it was broken out. But yeah, so you know, 42% each for Gen Z and millennials, and about 15% were Gen X. And you know, Gen X, I think we're talking a bit about the, you know, parenting and some of the same issues as millennials, but they were a bit more settled, probably spending a bit less time on social media. So those are some of the factors that contribute to, I would imagine it's as usual, it's always a combination of things. It's complex, but those are kind of some of the big things that are what is going on with that distribution in terms of the gender representation, or sorry, the generational representation in the conversation about mental health and in the workplace.
Awesome, Karen. Olivia, did you have anything to add before I ask my next question?
Karen did a wonderful job of addressing that. I cannot top that. So please feel free, Anitra.
Well, Karen, you kind of touched on it when you were wrapping up and you asked about, or you mentioned the gender divide on discussing mental health. I think that as you went through the opening, that you talked about that there are certain activities or certain instances that maybe drove up those who identify as a woman speaking about mental health versus those who identify as male. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that particular finding and what those points of interest or world events might have been that had each gender or those who identify as a particular gender speaking more about mental health?
That is a great question. I think within the case of female identifying people, we saw more conversation around family concerns and, you know, in some cases, you know, with especially with say, you know, millennials childcare. I think women were more open about, even though the breakdown does show that there were more men in this conversation, or more male identifying people in this conversation, that, you know, I feel like a lot of the concerns were really relevant for, highly relevant for women in terms of the kinds of jobs that they're in, which might tend to be more, you know, hospitality industry or restaurants or that sort of thing, and educators, and also, you know, healthcare. So those are some of the things I think women were particularly vocal in that arena. So it can be hard to suss that out, and we didn't go deep actually on the gender breakdown. It's something that when it's kind of close, it's like, okay, maybe this isn't telling us anything particularly interesting. These are topics that are, you know, largely important for both groups, but I feel like I heard the voice of people who are female identifying more in terms of like vocalizing their stress issues, even though our breakdown does show it to be slightly more male than female. And sometimes it's one, you know, it's one voice. For example, it might be that men were really, you know, vocal around like quitting. So, you know, and that can drive up the engagement and volume around that particular issue. So we didn't go real deep on it. The other, you know, like, there's a bunch of good questions that we didn't get to really like pull apart, like even, you know, whether, I'm sure there's plenty we could say around race. There's plenty we could say around certain job roles. unionization came up, and that was a big issue. And that's something that there's a whole lot to. So anyway, I think this was a fantastic study, and the focus that we took was really, rich, but there's always more. There's just always so much more, and it's just kind of exciting and kind of like, kind of frustrating for the person who's doing the data analysis. But yeah, there's there's so much. And I guess I would add too that there was I just noticed yesterday that the conference board released some findings around worker satisfaction, and it said they said that it's actually better now, and I'm wondering if that's a sign of hope that finally we've been through this disruptive period. People have done a lot of resets. Maybe they've quit a job that was unsatisfying for them, or they've seen their employers make substantive changes. But we're still seeing that that's less true for certain populations, and people who don't have the luxury of working in a hybrid or remote situation, were people who have to show up to a job place every day. They were less satisfied. Women tended to be less satisfied, and there were certain career paths that were also still suffering or experiencing some hardship. So there's generalities hide the nuance that is in the data. And so, but we're trying to tell the big story. And I'm hoping that we've all gone through this, and we're still going through it in some respects, but that it's resulting in some changes that are going to make things better for the long term.
Thank you, Karen. And then Anitra, I see that Erica wrote in the chat. I can take this one if that's okay. Awesome.
Yes, please do.
All right. So Erica wrote, would love to hear of any resources regarding recommended best practices and progressive campus-wide efforts to support both staff and student wellness and resilience. Thank you, Erica, for asking. So some of the recommendations that we provided that I think would be more like best geared toward sort of a campus environment could be some of these more peer-led outlets that we found to be the most beneficial tools. So I don't know if your campus already has anything similar to, I guess we call them employee resource groups in the study because this is more geared toward corporate leaders. But if you have maybe any student-led groups or employee-led groups of peers that allow for a space where these issues can be talked about, because peers were the most trusted relationship within the organization to speak about these issues with, that could be, I think, a tool that could be implemented campus-wide that would really help. And additionally, I don't know how this works with universities. It probably depends on who you're with, but we found that companies who invested financially in employee wellness, which included free visits with mental health professionals, really, those initiatives really worked for employees. So I know a lot of big university campuses offer counseling services to students and those sort of things. But if the university or campus could roll out any other sort of mental health support, free of charge for employees and students, that could be a pretty good suggestion. And other wellness initiatives too, like maybe if there are some sort of other wellness programs that they could provide to students, extracurriculars or things of that nature that are focused on promoting wellness. I think those would probably be some of the more applicable recommendations to that environment that we found in the research. Karen, do you have any other insights as far as recommendations for initiatives on a campus to support wellness and resilience?
Yeah, I do think that some of the deck that we, the presentation that we prepared I think a lot of those recommendations do have valuable applications. I mean, I would say, you know, some of the things that Irene pointed out, you know, just getting out in front of this issue and making sure that students are aware that this could happen, and you know, these are the resources, and you have to take, you're somewhat responsible for your own success in this area, but there are resources to help you, but you can't. I mean, I was in college in a simpler time, but you know, like I remember stress and burnout, and not really like paying attention to it. But I probably would have, you know, had there been resources, I probably would have done a lot better in some of the things that I was trying to do just by vocalizing those things. It just wasn't really a thing that we talked about as much. But the fact that there are so many great resources now, and that students just need to need to come forward and talk about it early, so that it's not like an 11th hour kind of attempt to get things on the right track when it's too late to really help.
Right.
No, I thought, Olivia, I thought you addressed it well.
And one other thing that I thought of, Erica, is I don't know if your students are still hybrid or doing online courses. I know that was more of a thing during COVID, and you know, as the years have gone on since, maybe it's not quite as much of a concern. But if you do have remote students, thinking about how to create those sort of social spaces where they can connect with peers on issues with mental health, would definitely be a consideration, because we found in the research that these remote groups really needed these social tools, especially, you know, in some cases even more so than the in-person groups. So definitely another consideration to take into account.
Irene, or any of the other educators who may be on the call, before Wadney, I get to your question, do you have any resources or want to share how your campus may be supporting you and your students who may experience mental health crises?
Yeah, sure, unless somebody else wants to jump in. But I mean, both, I teach at NYU in the grad program, and I teach undergrads at City College in New York. And there are multiple, you know, programs that are available to students. I think what some of what I see happening, and again, the grad students at NYU, that's different. They're, you know, they're older, they're working. It's not that they don't have the stress, but they manage it a little bit different. The undergrads seem to have more difficulty, and even though the programs are available to them, there's a hesitancy to take part, whether it be the mental stigma or whatever else is happening in their life. They seem to be a little more hesitant when all of these opportunities are there for them. So what I see, they're coming to me now. We just closed the semester this week. You know, several over the last week or so have come and you know, and said, I'm having difficulty, you know, I'm struggling, I need to pass. And so we try to find ways, of course, to make that happen. But I think even though the facilities are there for them, they're still feeling that there's a stigma of them partaking. And so maybe that's an area that as educators, we need to look at, you know, how do we encourage them? You know, you don't bring it out in an announcement every day in class, but how can you, you know, how can you help them? And so I think that they're kind of isolated a little bit in their own world with some of these issues, and they think that they're the only ones going through it, right? But if they only knew how many students are struggling with different issues, they would understand they are far from being the only one. So I think the universities and colleges are doing a good job providing those services. I think it's trying to get the students to make that move to take advantage of it.
Erica also dropped in the chat that she'd like to recommend training in mental health first aid and trauma-informed care implementation for staff and organizations. Thank you for sharing that, Erica. And now, Wadney, I want to get to your question. Is you dropped in the chat, you're not sure if this relates, but did you see any tweets or trends between the link of mental health and the Great Resignation? Karen and Olivia.
Karen, feel free to take this because I know you were probably closer to that.
Yeah,
Do you remember seeing anything?
Yeah, there was, again, this is something I felt like the term Great Resignation. Yes, they are kind of adjacent or related topics. What we saw, not so much like individuals using that term so much as we saw the media tweeting about it and people going like, oh yeah, I recognize that, or that's, that's my, that feels relevant to me, or that feels like, oh, I've seen like, 6 people on my team. And so that, you either like left without having a job in place or, had other to them insurmountable issues that they, drove them to change jobs or something like that. So people weren't like, employees maybe were not using that term as much, although they were recognizing it when, when the media was tweeting about it. And, but it certainly was a contributing factor. And some people were taking part of the Great Resignation because they're like, I'm out of here. I can get 10% more at X company doing the same thing. Or, so not all of it was sort of caused by people feeling like their mental health issues weren't being addressed. But in some cases, there was a connection that showed up. And I think the media, big media outlets tweeted out about the stories about what was driving the Great Resignation.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Karen. As we get ready to wrap up, I just want to offer this opportunity for Olivia and Karen to share any additional insights, any other suggestions. I will also be dropping some different resources in the chat for you to review, but I want to give this time to you all to just offer any additional support around these findings.
Yeah, absolutely. If you all have any questions or would like to see some of the recommendations described in more detail, please go ahead and head over to our webpage where the report is housed. We have a lot more detail on there. Of course, more than I could get into on this call, but I think we covered the basics, but I just dropped the link for that in the chat. So yes, feel free to head over to that. And if you have any questions, you're always free to email me or Karen.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hoping that, when you have a major disruptive kind of situation and it's causing people to be more open about their mental health concerns, that it's companies and organizations and educational educational institutions are sitting up and taking notice, and that this is in the long term going to result in better things going forward for people who, we all have our moments when we're vulnerable about this issue. And I think the fact that we can talk about it a little bit more better, and that there are some positive changes coming about, that, so I'm hopeful, so I always, I think change can be very hard at first, but it tends to lead to good things in the long term. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, Olivia, Karen, thank you both for being here. Thank you for conducting this important research and sharing with us findings. I think this has been very insightful for not only professors and students, but employers and employees. And Irene, my colleague at PRSAEA, thank you for being here and sharing your insights with us. And thank you all for joining us today. Again, I would like to thank our sponsor, which is Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, for supporting DPRC. And thank you all for joining us for our bonus session of DPRC. We will be taking the summer off and we will see you again in September. We look forward to having you again as we bring more to you to have deeper and broader conversations about diversity in the PR classroom. I hope you all take an opportunity to look at this particular report. I also hope that you will take the resources that have been shared with you in the chat and use them as you need them. If you are in crisis right now, please call or text 988. If you have students or employees, or if you ever need these resources, they're there for you to use and to share. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week. And thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you in September. Have a great day.